for Academic Affairs and now Provost here at Regent. He completed his doctorate in clinical psychology. Welcome, folks. Come in and join us at Bowling Green State University. And he also has done a lot of clinical work in ADHD specific populations and also in military settings. And he is truly one of the trailblazers in the field of integration, of how do we integrate Christian worldview in the field of clinical psychology. So some of his textbooks or books that he's written have become our seminal texts in the field. And there's so much more I can say, but I don't want to take away from his time on this podium, on the stage. So if you would join me in welcoming him for the first keynote address, Dr. Hathaway.
So welcome. I've had a chance to be just an eavesdropper during the roundtable the last day or so with our guests that are arriving. It's an amazing group of folks. So I've been in the psychology religion space off and on since the early 80s, and that sometimes brought me to other settings like the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion that's more interdisciplinary. I don't think I've ever seen that kind of a range of engagement of people doing active research on human flourishing as it intersects aspects of Christian life or the Christian world, and it's really quite an inspiring kind of engagement. So we look forward to seeing those discussions continue. So today I'm going to be talking not primarily as a psychologist, although psychology is always shaping my thinking, but more from my philosophical and theoretical theological journey. So on the screen here is a picture of the oasis at En-Gedi. This is one of the two freshwater springs in the Judean desert by the Dead Sea. And this shows up in scripture in some places. It's an ancient known spring. But it's, I think, a good metaphor for what a distinctive sort of Christian understanding of flourishing is. So we have the things needed here for abundant life, but it's in the midst of a desert. So there is flourishing in a context where flourishing it may seem surprising. That's a little bit different than the kind of image of flourishing that my Aristotelian professors and more Epicurean professors who were drawn to kind of a straightforward hedonism would have thought of. We've also had seminars here by positive psychology leaders, including Marty Seligman, who gave some talks in the adjacent space in the library atrium. And I really appreciate much that's happened in the positive psychology movement, but that also gives us a conception of flourishing that has become a bit more nuanced, but still is a little bit different, I think, from a distinctively Christian approach in the sense that I'm going to be talking about it. So I'm going to skip the first couple intro slides, which is the abstract in the program, objectives that we need for CE. And let's move right on to our topic, so flourishing. So from just a word study perspective, we can go to a standard dictionary, in this case Merriam-Webster, who defines flourishing as having attained a desired end state or good fortune. Synonyms that are listed for this includes being successful, prospering, thriving, many more. From a recent article in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health by Logan, Berman, and Prescott, they say this: the term flourishing comes from the Latin word florio, which means to bloom. Historically, the words bloom and flourish were used interchangeably to describe a state of health, growth, success, and abundance. More recently, flourishing has been defined as the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including contexts in which the person lives, by Harvard University's Flourishing Program. So I think that's your definition, Tyler, right? So, and thank you for that work. So when I talk about a distinctively Christian approach, we not only have the challenge of thinking about what flourishing is, but what is a distinctively Christian approach? And that's no easy task when you think about the nature of Christianity. So this is a faith spanning many epochs. So it's a faith across vast spans of history. It's also a faith present in every human culture. And at least according to one data source, this is from the Gordon Conwell Center for the Study of Global Christianity, there's over 45,000 Christian denominations, let alone how many of us have been active in churches and know that within our own Sunday school classes, people have different understandings of Christianity, let alone denominational differences. So in what sense can there be a Christian anything in that context? And all I can say is I'm drawing here from a tradition that thinks of terms like core Christianity, mere Christianity, basic Christianity, historic Christianity, little o Orthodox Christianity, little c Catholic Christianity, or sometimes we use the phrase biblical worldview in evangelical settings for roughly something like this. For one of my graduate projects, I did a causal model study, and I'm not going to try to explain this if I still remembered what all those things were, but at any rate, the circles are the latent constructs, the underlying thing we think we're measuring. The squares are the manifest variables that are the indicators. These are the scales used to measure it. And what a covariance structure model does is it extracts the shared variance from different measures of the same purported thing. And so if we think that of our measures as imperfect measures, it's like trying to take your temperature through a sensor thermometer that you put on the skin and one that reads it from a distance, measuring the infrared energy being given off, that sort of thing. And then you were to look at the degree of error in each of those instruments, but look for where they tend to agree. When things go up, they go up, and how much do they go up? You can quantify that. You can put a number on the level of agreement, and that's what this kind of method does. Well, I'm not going to try to do a covariance structure analysis of Christianity from all of its different indicators. What I'm going to say is it's that kind of thing. When you look across the broad swath of Christianity across the eras, across the cultures, across its different historical contexts, what we end up with is, I think, some common cores that have been recognized by the church going back centuries. Vincent of Lorenz talked about Catholic in this sense as what the church has always believed. That may be a bit of an overstatement if by church you mean human organizations that claim to be Christian, but there seems to be a critical mass that comes to be this historic tradition. And it's from that tradition that I'm going to be really defining what I mean by distinctive in this context. Just to let you know how much these different expressions of Christianity converge on us. So in 2012, I was part of a group that went to Beijing, and we had a chance to meet with the Archbishop of Beijing, and this is the oldest Catholic church in Beijing. It means exuminant church. It's called the South Church, I think, is their colloquial name for it. But what the Archbishop was telling us is that the Catholic Church had been cut off from being able to have regular contact with the Vatican after the Maoist Cultural Revolution, and they continued to practice masses in Latin all the way up until the 1990s when they were allowed to reconnect. And in fact, he was the first archbishop in that role in Beijing that was jointly approved by both the Vatican and also the Catholic Patriotic Association, which is a Marxist-approved organization there in Beijing. So when you think about that, here we have ancient practices of the faith, ancient worship practices being done in the language of the Roman Empire just before the turn of this millennium in Beijing, in China. So if you think about the expanse of Christian expression that conveys, still converging on us, still connecting us. All right, so I'm not going to try to say I'm going to give you all the distinctives or even that I am going to say these things in theologically precise ways. So my colleagues from the Divinity School, I'm going to count on you exercising grace here. But at any rate, I want to start by saying what I think isn't distinctive as we approach these things. First, Christians, along with many other forms of life, have had wisdom traditions. So Judaism, Christianity, both in the Bible have wisdom traditions that talk about things like how we live a wise life. And they also develop systematic reflective cultures on what is wise from those traditions. Philosophy is known as that, but it shows up in other terms and other forms in other cultures. So reflections that become part of a systematic examination of those wisdom insights. In the ancient Near East, wisdom literature showed up in those three forms. So sort of short proverbial sayings or maxims like the book of Proverbs, longer sort of sagely discourses that often had sort of a pessimistic tone to them. It was lessons learned from the school of hard knocks like the book of Ecclesiastes. And there were other kinds of allegories that talked about the energy and ambitions of youth, like the Song of Songs. So those kinds of things are part of Jewish thought, and we see those traditions being widespread in many cultures in the ancient Near East. And more recently, of course, what we've had the pleasure of hearing much of from people from different backgrounds at this roundtables that have just occurred is there's been a focus in social scientific context on identifying the common components of human flourishing through research. And that's an exciting thing to see unfold and develop. But as I mentioned, I'm anchoring most of this today in my more philosophical roots. Pursuing flourishing, or the good life, as some people may talk about a closely related notion, is a core of the classic human philosophy tradition. So in the ancient Greek tradition, philosophy kind of breaks into two halves: natural philosophy, what is the nature of the real, what do things like causality mean, those kinds of questions, and human philosophy. So what is the good life? Is there a way to know what is right, what is wrong, those kinds of questions. What gives life meaning would be another component of that. In the 20th century, human philosophy with a focus on the good life or on flourishing had a resurgence. And it had a resurgence largely because of an over-focus on moral decision-making principles tied to a kind of science model that arose in the Enlightenment. So people were looking for a way to be as certain about knowing what right and wrong is as we know about things in the natural world through modern science. And so this turn towards models, and usually the two major models were some kind of variety of deontological ethics, duty-based ethics, so we identify what our ethical principles are that apply to us, and then we just apply it to case examples. So what principle applies here? When you do a kind of geometric deduction, that's what our obligation is. Utilitarian models were cost-based models. So you have some kind of end state that you think is good, and you try to take you to a path of life that will maximize that end state. So for Jeremy Bentham, it was pleasure over pain. He thought that was the one great objective thing that all creatures are motivated by. And so the utilitarian model. Now, we have largely done away with his fictional measurement of subjective units of distress or subjective units of pleasure, except we still do stuff like that in psychotherapy. But people have preserved his cost-benefit analysis model for decision-making and put it in economic terms. And so he brought us that kind of thing. But both of those approaches really are focusing on knowing what the right or wrong thing is to do, even if when we figure it out, we don't have people who could care less if they do it or not. So that is, there's no focus on the agent who makes moral decisions. And people were saying, hold it, there's something missing here. I mean, for Kant, the best he could say is, well, this is why we need a God. We need a moral lawgiver that's going to met out rewards and punishments at the end of the whole thing, at the end of life. Now, Kant very rarely appealed to supernatural groundings for ethics. He was specifically not trying to do that. But for moral motivation, the divine lawgiver was the only thing he could appeal to. And he didn't do much with that. That was his way of responding to that problem of motivation. In 1958, Elizabeth Anscombe, the Oxford philosopher who was a Christian, wrote Modern Moral Philosophy, in which she said we need to return to these kind of agentic theories that we saw in Aristotle. And that led to a resurgence or return to these questions of what is well-being, what is it to have a good life, and how do we become the kind of creatures that inhabit that good life, whatever it is. Later on, other folks continued to engage this. Alistair McIntyre wrote a book called After Virtue, where he said we're living in kind of a crisis where people have competing visions of the good life. And if a virtue is whatever character trait helps you achieve the good life, and a vice is what interferes with it, we might have competing virtues and vices depending on competing conceptions of the good life. Now, he got a little more optimistic, but in this book, before he looked for ways to kind of bridge across our differences a little more, he sort of envisioned the best we can do is hunker down with our communities of like-minded people. Now, he was saying this before we had social networks with, groups that we join and disjoin, but he was saying that we would just hunker down with our like-minded folks and hope we outsurvive our competitors. So our form of life hangs out and survives. That's what he means by kind of after virtue. Well, I think this was an interesting discussion. We actually read that as our common read book in our philosophy department with libertarians and Marxists and communists. I think there were two of us who had some kind of self-identification as Christian, but it was a fun thing to talk through that from all those different perspectives for that year. If we think about this distinction that emerges from the classic sort of virtue tradition, there's a distinction between hedonic understandings, which really focus on pleasure or pain, and as Dr. Ord mentioned in the introduction, eudaimonic understandings, which Aristotle saw as a fulfillment of our natural potentials. And so more something like in modern psychodynamic or humanistic terms, something like self-actualization. When I mentioned the social scientific approaches with focusing on research, in psychology you can recognize these trajectories. That most of the study in this area is anchored in studies of subjective well-being or happiness. It is becoming increasingly, though, interdisciplinary in nature, taking better accounts for virtue, things like meaning. Ed Diener, who passed away a couple years ago, was often called Dr. Happiness. He developed a little subjective well-being scale that was widely used and built into studies of the Human Misery Index and things of that sort. His student, Bob Emmons, became a Christian in grad school and is now, I think, still the editor of the Journal of Positive Psychology. Continues to do much of this work. But for Ed, it was this idea of measuring subjective life satisfaction and pleasure states over suffering that he kind of tied into his scales. Now, so I had a chance to talk with him a year or two before he died when he was doing some work at UVA. And at that point, people were trying to promote these kind of positive psychological states by things like giving people gratitude exercises to do. So you write notes of gratitude to people that have helped you in some way in life or made an impact on you. You reflect on good things that have happened today, that kind of thing. But Ed said this. He said, the problem is some people do this a lot already. So if you're trying to increase their positive mood state, he said his wife has been just naturally grateful throughout her whole life. So if he took her through their gratitude exercises, she wouldn't get any happier because she's already like maxing out the benefit from that. So they identified 11 different kinds of things that seem to correlate or predict positive mood. And they developed a group protocol that one of our former faculty that worked over there, Jeff Jennings, helped to carry out. But basically, each week you would be kind of taught a different positive affect enhancing technique for life, and maybe you'd find one that worked for you. So that kind of thing. But you see the focus here is on feeling positive. And now the interesting thing about much of this emotional research, if you look at the work by Watson and Clark, for instance, in the 70s and 80s, is that we know that positive and negative affect are orthogonal. So it means they're independent. So one can go up and the other stay where it is, or go up too, so it's not like on a teeter-totter. Sometimes people think to be happier, you have to be less unhappy. It's not a complete lack of correlation, but they can function in these different ways. And in language, we often even have terms that describe these kind of different ways of these affects combining. So bittersweet, something positive about it, but something kind of negative too, right? Something sad. So we have these ways of describing these patterns, and you can measure them. And they have different patterns of daily variations in people's lives. I looked at this in variation in daily mood, religious coping, and stress in 10 different subjects over 90 days longitudinally for my doctoral dissertation. And we really do see variations on a daily basis. And some cases with negative mood, those changes can happen much more quickly within minutes. Positive mood can as well, but tends not to vary as much within a day as negative affect does. So we know that kind of stuff too. So if this is all about affect engineering, helping people feel good, then we turn this whole movement into what Marty Seligman called a happyology, which he wasn't using in a positive sense. He didn't want his approach to be just that, to be a happyology, just helping us feel good. By the way, if that's all it is, if that's what life is about, is us flourishing by just feeling happy, we need to develop really good techniques, learn what lifestyles promote that, or get really good at chemical control. And they're morally interchangeable, right? If that's all it is. But I don't think that's a Christian perspective per se. All right, so Marty Seligman did engage with people like Chris Peterson. This idea of virtues and other categories of meaning, for instance, is important. Now, Marty said he believed that the negative affect levels in people's lives kind of operate around a set point range, and that we often can't do much to fundamentally alter someone's negative affect, but we can increase positive affect through things like finding more meaningful engagements in our daily life. So meaning increases that. And one way you can try to treat someone who suffers from something like anxiety or depression, some other dysphoric state, is to help them feel less negative. We try to do that through medications, through many of our interventions in psychotherapy. But we can also promote things in life that compensate for that help them to do well despite the suffering. And for some people that have protracted treatment-resistant forms of depression, that's very important. So we had some clients like that in the military that had been through previous providers at the base for years, and they were just kind of like Eeyore. So one of the terms psychiatrists use for the kind of person I was talking about is double depression. So dysthymia, recurrent major depression, marginally still functional, so they were still able to stay in their job, but just life always with a dark cloud over it, that kind of thing. So you try to make that better, and sometimes you can with folks, but you can also help them not wait until the depression is gone to find things that improve the quality of their life. It's a different perspective. And so I want to say positive psychology is open to that kind of nuance. So we shouldn't characterize them as just about making people try to smile all the time, whether or not it's natural. But there are some folks that really argue that this positive negative affect balance is the thing. So Barbara Frigerson's famous happiness ratio, which she had to retract a bit. First, she was saying the data shows if you have about 3 times more positive affect to negative affect, then you're happy. Well, it depends on who and circumstances, and it's not always, that ratio doesn't seem to hold up consistently. So she's backed it off a little bit, but still believes a preponderance of positive over negative affect is the thing that drives happiness. And some of you have been following this work in psychology probably know Seligman's perma theory of well-being, connecting the positive psychology focus with the broader notion of well-being. So that he thinks setting up the conditions for well-being involve a level of positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning and purpose, and accomplishment. So we are starting to expand the focus here beyond just my affect state to a more broad notion of well-being. But sometimes people use concepts of well-being and flourishing interchangeably. I think they are distinct, but they certainly are connected in this work. I appreciate the work that Tyler and Byron and the team on the Global Flourishing Study have been doing on human flourishing. So I think that's your domains, right, Tyler? So at any rate, I think that a distinctively Christian approach doesn't disagree with any of this, and it's not surprising that Christians have had a lot to do with orchestrating these models. I think Aristotle would probably feel pretty comfortable with most of these. Stoics, I'm not so sure. They might have a bit of a different opinion, but Aristotle, I think, would. But I think Christians can affirm what is common to human flourishing. It's just the complexity of a Christian worldview and assessment of our life suggests that we're in a kind of state right now where flourishing may not be achievable at this level by everyone if we think about it in these terms. Certainly if we were to think of in terms of happiness, in terms of a positive negative affect balance, and you think of a sort of affect dipstick you put in someone's emotion centers, so where would they come out? Well, life isn't always a happy life this side of the resurrection. Christian thinkers, theologians have also been doing work on this. Here's just some of the books that have come out in recent years that reflect on models of flourishing from a theological perspective. Cornelius Plantinga, in an influential piece on this, said, in the Bible, shalom means universal flourishing, wholeness, and delight, a rich state of affairs in which natural needs are satisfied and natural gifts fruitfully employed, a state of affairs that inspires joyful wonder as its creator and savior opens the door and welcomes the creatures in whom he delights. Shalom, in other words, is the way things ought to be. So people like Pennington and other folks have been pointing out that the modern concept of flourishing is probably a better English translation of shalom than peace. which is the more common one used in the English text. There's two other word groups that are heavily tied to what Pennington believes are a biblical picture of flourishing. And certainly the New Testament writers were aware of ancient wisdom traditions. They were aware of Greco-Roman philosophies of flourishing. Pennington's argument is that the Bible was written explicitly as a Christian account of what flourishing is. He thinks that's an intentional part of how it's structured and put together. I found his case convincing, but it is an argument. So I'm going to suggest 5 distinctive contours that I think I can draw from that mere kind of latent Christianity that's the core of that historical and pluralistic expressions of Christianity that we've encountered throughout history. I'm not saying this is an exhaustive list. After I did this, I thought, well, I want to add this too and that too, and we'd be here much longer than we're going to be, and I'm keeping you from lunch, maybe dinner if we keep going. But so I'm not going to do that. But I am going to focus on these 5 postulates, and I really intend these because I see them as standing in contrast to either the presumptions or the explicit assertions of some of the approaches to flourishing that I heard in my philosophy mentors, who were largely secular and non-Christian. Okay, let me talk about the first one. So my first postulate, and again, this is a postulate, so for those of you who are researchers, there have been some research along the edges of these things that I participated in or that I know other people have, but I'm not presenting these as research conclusions or even necessarily stating them in the form of research hypotheses yet, although I think they could be translated into that. So the first postulate, Christian belief calls us to non-utopian hopefulness. So one of the things Marty said when he was here, Marty Seligman, is knowing our audience at Regent, he said, I think psychology needs to be a whole lot more Pelagian and less Augustinian. And what he meant by that is the idea that we can use these positive psychology techniques to perfect our own well-being through human effort. And he thought that psychology was starting from a standpoint of pathology where people need help to get over their mental illness. So see, the perspective there was self-perfectibility. And that sort of fits his kind of general worldview. I didn't agree with that particular way of framing it, but I understood his point. So what I'm going to suggest here, though, is that a Christian view of flourishing will be hopeful. It will not be cynical and sort of defeatist, and yet it will, through the doctrine of sin, be aware that we live in an imperfect, fallen world where self-perfectibility is not something we would expect. That doesn't mean there can't be progress or improvement. Now, how much in this life? Well, there we're not going to find a common core. So it depends on a lot. Your doctrine of salvation, whether or not you believe in things like theosis, whether or not you believe in entire sanctification, partial sanctification, or kind of Lutheran ideas that we're simultaneously sinners and saints because of imputed righteousness. So all these theological doctrines might lead to different practical expectations about how much transformation in this imperfect life we can expect from people or cultures. And so I do think there's going to be some difference in Christian assessment about that. But still, I think a belief that the ultimate telos of creation is flourishing, meaning the kinds of things we see in the Global Flourishing Study assessment, is a kind of generalizable goal across those dimensions. I think we can, across those different facets of Christianity. But also, and this again is not a universal belief among Christians, but it's a common one in many different theologies. I believe that the theological assessment of our current human existence is that we live in the yet and not yet. We live in a world where the ideal state is not here and is not intended, is not asserted to be here, but is emerging, can be glimpsed. It's partially present or partially realized. So from this point of view, the expectation would be that full flourishing, meaning the kind of existence that we have in a paradise garden where all pain and suffering and loss is gone, that kind of image from the ancient Near East, which we see both in Eden and at the end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, in the New Jerusalem by the tree of life. That kind of image won't be fully realized in this current age, but we might see glimpses of it. We might see it breaking in. So we have a near kingdom, but not a fully present kingdom. This theological difference was articulated in the 20th century by the difference between a realized eschatology and an inaugurated eschatology. The realized eschatology view was common among folks like C.H. Dodd, who basically argued that through human advance in science, this was the classic 19th century Protestant kind of liberal mindset, we can perfect the human race. We can solve our problems and we'll move on to a kind of utopian existence. The inaugurated eschatology alternative that emerged among neo-Orthodox and some evangelical scholars in the mid-20th century was this idea of yet not yet, where we expect the kingdom of God to be present and achievable to some degree, but not fully until the return of Christ. In the evangelical context, Ladd would be the clearest example of that. So what would be an inaugurated eschatology? The metaphor that's often used is the comparison to World War II, D-Day and V-Day. So once D-Day hit, pretty much everyone that was sane knew it was over for the Germans, but not tomorrow. So my father-in-law, who was in the Battle of the Bulge and all of that, had a lot of suffering to go through yet. So, but they knew it was coming. They knew there would be a V-Day. So it was already sort of present implicitly in D-Day, that kind of an image. So that's the kind of context. I will tell you, this is more consistent with what we tend to believe on our campus, although we don't have a universal commitment to one version of this eschatology. I do think it's common across many biblical worldviews. And it's what I sort of expect myself about the human condition. That could lead to a defeatism if the kingdom is not fully yet, except we are called. And what does Jesus tell us in the Lord's Prayer, right? That God's kingdom come. It's this kind of expectation of doing kingdom work. And the kingdom is characterized in the Bible and the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies from a Christian point of view, and in the New Testament as a state that I think has much of the contours that we see in something like the Global Flourishing Studies idea of flourishing. Another postulate. Tempered Christian realism is vital for optimal flourishing in a fallen world. So I've got this little cartoon I use sometimes when I give lectures on problem solving. So one of the problems people have when they're used to solving a problem in a certain way and it's not working is they don't want to go back. So the human tendency is to always move towards the solution. So this little cartoon shows a dog trying to eat its food on a leash, but it's wrapped its leash around a tree. And it's made it too short, so the food bowl's right in front of it. It can't get to it. Now, it could get to it if it would back away from the food and unwrap the leash around the tree and then go back. But we're very much like that dog. So sometimes in an imperfect world, solutions that are partial, that in a socio-political realm, if we look at Niebuhr's Christian realism, might look like compromise from your principles, might move you closer towards the end goal. Those are not the kinds of strategies utopians pursue. Okay, but they are the strategies people use in a world where you think we can only make imperfect progress, but we want to make progress. We want to get closer to the goal, so the perfect doesn't become the enemy of the good. I think in a Christian eschatology, there's a reason to expect something like that. So what will that mean for human flourishing studies? If we're doing the end goal of what it's like once we get to Eden, well, it might mean that a flourishing life might lead people to do short-term reversals on their flourishing measures for there to be more flourishing communally or even with that person over the course of their life. Isn't that what we try to tell our students about keeping up with their homework, right? So suffer a bit for better outcomes later. I think a related part of that is when we learn to do these kinds of adjustments in a fallen world where we can't immediately attain what we know God would like for us all to have as kind of an end state goal, is it can cultivate something I'm calling compensatory virtues. And really my thought on this is tempered from my doctoral work, which was with Ken Pargaman in Religion and Coping. And I think a lot of the ways to think about coping research is it's a kind of compensation. It's a kind of it's a way to help us deal with life struggles so that it doesn't cost us as much or so that we can actually grow from it. But there's two kinds of ways of thinking about coping from in its purposes from the Folkman and Lazarus tradition. One is that we're trying to problem solve, get rid of the problem so we don't have to cope with it anymore. The other is we're trying to maintain, so that when we're going through the problem, if we can't immediately get rid of it, we're trying to not have it do more damage to us than it needs to. So maintenance coping versus problem-solving coping, those kinds of things. What do we get from maintenance coping, or even from problem-solving coping where the problems aren't obvious and we have to keep trying and retrying? I think we learn things like persistence. We can learn self-care skills to offset the difficulty of the stressors. Now, this sometimes isn't always a good thing. For a while, I was a stress management officer at a military base, and right after the Gulf War, everyone was back, but the military was eliminating its middle rank positions. That's what happens after big military victories when there's a drawdown. So there's less positions to move people into for a career, so they start rewarding the successful soldiers by getting rid of their jobs. And so, at any rate, so these flight units were having their teams work 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts, all leave denied for 6 months. And domestic violence was going up, substance abuse problems, people having rage incidents where they're kicking over file cabinets, things like that, which doesn't work well when you're in the military if you're an E4 or something. So at any rate, so they had me come out and do stress management briefings for these folks, which I did. I taught them how to deal with stress a little bit, and some things improved. But my private discussions with those squadron commanders was, you're interfering with readiness by this pace of readiness drilling. I said, we know, but if we don't do this, these folks will not get promoted. It's their only way to build a jacket in this austere environment. Will they move forward? Okay, so what is healthy in that kind of a system? So I talked with them about the wisdom of that, and yes, so they are preserving either the short-term benefit of these folks or their long-term career benefits, but at some point you have to weigh the cost. I mean, if they end up being drummed out of the military because of bad conduct or their marriages fall apart, is it worth it? And the commander has to decide. And then ultimately, of course, we would hope the military would say, but if this is interfering with readiness, even if it's bad for their careers, we can't do it. But military people are people too, and they don't want to look at all the people working for them and say, we didn't fly as much as Squadron A, so I know you're not going to get the promotion, but oh well, but you're rested. So those are problems. So coping can help us do better, but sometimes still life circumstances are unreasonable. And sometimes there's not much we can do with that. I was intrigued with Mother Teresa's journaling about the loss of kind of much of her spiritual joy in her life, later in her life, even though she was doing this great, meaningful work. And she went through a kind of a dark night of the soul later in her life. Now, from a purely hedonistic perspective, in fact, I heard Christopher Hitchens say this in a debate with Alistair McGrath, she was being irrational. She should have left where she was doing her ministry and gone to Vegas or some other vacation spot, right? So she should have done what made her feel better. I don't know if the rest of us would assess her life choices that way, even though her happiness in a pure affect over a negative affect standpoint was lower. And so I do think there might be opportunities from a Christian point of view for us to think in flourishing about compensatory virtues. What are they? So Ken Pargament, developing a religious coping model in the late 70s, early 80s, from the Folkman and Lazarus model, looked at things like religious coping strategies, religious coping functions, religious coping outcomes. And one of the things he found was that people sometimes try to solve problems to solve the problems. Surprise. Sometimes they try to solve problems in a way that help them survive them, maintenance kind of goals. Or we already knew that from Folkman and Lazarus's research. But he found independent variance accounted for by people solving problems for spiritual reasons. Look, even if this problem doesn't go away, even if I continue to have the same depression, I feel closer to God. I'm learning what God wants me to learn about my life from this. And those spiritual outcomes had to be measured as distinct things from the general psychological and problem resolution outcomes that the coping people typically researched. Similarly, there's spiritual functions distinct from those other functions too. So maybe part of what we get by going through life struggles, even if our flourishing measures may not look as well from the kinds of things we share with people from other backgrounds, are spiritual development, spiritual compensatory virtues that get developed in that kind of place. Isn't this sort of what the Bible talks about when they talk about things developing through trial? It's not that Christians are the only ones that think this way, but I do think there's a particular emphasis on it from a New Testament standpoint, partly because of the expectation that we live in this flawed, fallible world where problems will likely persist no matter how many we solve. It's kind of a life of whack-a-mole, right? It's kind of what we expect from existence. Okay, a third postulate. Christian models of flourishing will be agape anchored. So certainly for my utilitarian professors like R.J. Fry, it was interesting to hear them defend why someone would ever give their life to save someone as a firefighter. So he can argue why there might be a duty to do that. Utilitarianism is not properly understood a narrowly selfish perspective. It's not the greatest good and the least amount of pain for me. It's the greatest good and the least amount of suffering for the greatest number. So it might be your duty to let yourself be sacrificed. But what utilitarianism doesn't do is give us any account for what would motivate someone to do that. It just has no basis for that. And so it's a problem here. The closest you come to it is talking about two people watching their back on a battlefield. Yes, by me looking out for you, I might put myself at greater risk, but by us looking out for each other, we're both safer than we would be if we didn't do that. That's the closest you can get to an argument, but that doesn't really work when you can have people who can do social loafing effectively. So I just won't do my part, but I'll make sure you can't find out about it. Well, that would be the most rational position from a strictly naturalistic utilitarian standpoint, because then I get the benefits of you covering me, but I don't have to do the payments of covering you. So I just have to be a really effective social loafer. So that's the problem with that kind of thinking, I believe. But from an agape standpoint, we actually are called to sacrifice. And yet, even from a long-term hedonistic standpoint, because of the afterlife, because of eternity, there is a payoff. So it's not a life without reward, even when we engage in self-sacrifice. I do think the Christian account gives room for an agape-based view of life that is a stronger foundation than I'm aware of in any other worldview. There's some others that approximate functioning like this, but I don't think there's anything quite like this robust basis the biblical view gives us. And that might mean our models of flourishing have to allow for some people choosing lives where they individually flourish less, but it is a net gain on society. Now, I will say this, the fourth postulate about that. That doesn't mean I'm saying the Christian should feels most spiritual when they are suffering more than someone else. It's not that self-mortification, those Christian ideas, or ascetic kind of spiritual lives are intrinsic goods, because I don't think they are from a biblical point of view. Now here we could have some debates as Christians. I think they are instrumental goods. They're goods because of what they help us achieve. If we're doing them for their own sake, it's a kind of self-injury that I don't think is a righteous act. I don't think that's what these are for. But still, we have to balance these things. So even though there is a place for self-denial and self-sacrificial giving, we know, for instance, that if caregivers don't engage in proper self-care habits, then they will be likely less able to serve others as long or to serve them as well. So you actually end up in trying to heroically help the other when maybe heroism isn't what is needed, burning yourself out, having problems that end up causing suffering, and you're having less ability to help others. So we see that debate between the Stoic conception of Christian life and a biblical conception. This comes from the worldview theorist David Nagel, a Christian writer who I think has passed on now. But if you look at Aristotle, to be happy, we need to have character states that help us flourish, plus sufficient external goods for us to do well. So you can have good character, and if you're starving, life is not flourishing. So we need both external reality being sufficiently conducive to a flourishing human life and our internal states. For Stoics, virtue alone was sufficient. It doesn't matter what's happening out there. Just have the right attitude, and that's what matters. So learn to deny yourself, learn to live a strict disciplined life so you temper and you have the stiff upper lip, and you don't live by your emotions, you live just by your principles that govern everything. So we hear preachers say this, right? Don't live by your emotion, live by your principles. Very Stoic. You know, the Vulcans in Star Trek are not purely logical, they're Stoics. That's the Stoic perspective, right? So All right. The Christian point of view for Nagel, and I think he's right about this, but again, Christians have drifted towards more Stoic understandings, some more Aristotelian, is that we do need certain kind of external goods for humans to function as God intended us to function ideally, but it also involves a character state that may involve, in this life, of course, self-denial for a greater good, delaying gratification. And in some cases, for the Christian who gives their life for another, that may be delaying gratification for the rest of your life. Okay, but if we do this needlessly, that's no great virtue. And then the last postulate I've put in for this presentation is that Christian flourishing affirms the new but not the old self. I think this is key, and I don't think it's really that radically different than others except for our assessment of what the new and the old self are. But many people talk like this isn't the case. So in psychology, in the humanistic psychology movement, there was a push to emphasize the natural innate goodness and potential of human beings, and this idea that we need to allow people to just become what they're naturally inclined to be, and they will be healthy. So this was Rogers, the idea of organismic valuing. So what messes people up for Rogers is putting conditions of worth on them where they start doubting themselves, they don't kind of work through their own experiencing of life and just kind of develop as they're naturally inclined to develop. Now Rogers, I'm told by his research director, who was a Catholic, had some doubts about that later on in his life when he saw the kind of hyper-narcissism that came out of the 60s humanistic movement, but he didn't write any articles in AP correcting himself. So at any rate, that's this kind of idea. A colleague of mine here, Mark Airhouse, and I were asked to comment on the draft of the appropriate therapeutic resolutions for sexual orientation from APA in 2009, and they asked us to address this, particularly on the topic of people that are gender or sexual minorities who are religiously conservative in a traditional Judeo-Christian kind of sexual ethic culture. So what do we do with those folks? And some of those folks will choose not to pursue a gay-affirming life, whatever that means. It might be in celibacy, but they see themselves as gay, or they may reject that label. There's a variety of options. They knew these cases were there. So Judith Glassgold, other folks that are very definitely advocates of gay-affirming outcomes, knew that they couldn't override the client's autonomy and just say this has to be the one path everyone chooses. And so what we wrote in our description that they put into the policy was there is a distinction for some people between congruence, living congruently with what you feel is your true self, and your ideals. Now, I think that's a little bit of an oversimplistic distinction, but it got across something. That for some people, their values and their ideals are more central to what they consider sacred to their identity than what they feel like, to use a crude term, instinctively. Okay, these kinds of things. And what is a therapist's role? So the Rogerian idea is that if we can all just find this organismic congruence, but sometimes our impulses lead us one way and not the other. Now, in the case of LGBTQ issues, we can see the tension with this kind of thinking, and it continues to play out in culture. In fact, in the current revision of the APA Ethics Code, there are some people that are arguing we get rid of client autonomy as an ethical principle so that we can correct them if clients are inclined to do irrational things like not be gay affirming if they're traditionally religious. And so that's the argument. I will tell you so far they're resisting that, although they're nuancing the language a bit. So this is a challenge. The same thing played out in feminist ethics with women that are in domestic violence situations. Men too, but mostly women is what the literature was written for. So if they don't want to leave because of tradition, their religious beliefs, or whatever, if there's domestic violence going on, some feminist therapists say, we just need to tell people they have to leave anyhow. We have to do it in clinical, effective ways, but basically don't care what the client's goal is, this is the goal. You have to just choose it, work towards it, that kind of thing. I do think when we look at the Ephesians, Colossians, and other accounts of the new versus the old life, it's a kind of Christian table of virtues and vices. It doesn't say that we should just be our true selves. We should be our true new self, would be a sort of a mixture of the modern way of talking and the biblical way of talking. And that's a distinction. That's a distinction, I think, between what our field has often valued. But I do think it's common in many cultures. Even in the most sort of humanistic versions of psychology that exist, there's things they don't approve of. So Rogers, I don't think, would encourage people to put a lot of conditions of worth on their kids, which itself is a judgment. Right? He wouldn't try to say it in a moralizing way, but that would be his bias. And so we all have sort of limits that we go to some extent, and it has to do with forms of life that we think are conducive to the goals of whatever we envision the good life to be and those that are not. Well, anyhow, there's other things we could talk about. So the one I thought about added that I'm going to just mention in an unformed way is I do think part of the biblical tradition gives us a whole form of life. Like many ancient Near Eastern wisdom traditions, there's lots of wisdom. If you look at Proverbs, for instance, proverbial wisdom is sometimes called gnomic wisdom, little statements of knowledge of how things work well. But in every culture that uses that kind of wisdom literature, it's balanced by a sort of an opposing idea on this hand and on that hand. So if you take the verse atomistically and use it as this is what the wise way is to life, you'll find places where it leads you astray. So you have to look at the whole package of teaching to have the wisdom play out in those cultures. I think that's true in the book of Proverbs too, or in Poor Richard's Almanac, or wherever we use that kind of wisdom guidance. So we have to have this balanced kind of perspective with a vision of what the good life or the flourishing life should be, and we move towards that. And that's a more complex thing, because what we want to do is find simple solutions, 5 strategies that lead you to a happier marriage, right? So psychologists, when they go to pop culture, are famous for these problems, even though sometimes we get long-running syndicated television shows out of it. Anyhow, so at any rate, these things are problems, and I think that kind of thing isn't the biblical path to wisdom. It's the whole counsel of Scripture, as one phrase puts it, which is a much more complex, lifelong kind of formation process. It's probably that way in most forms of life. If you think of, Zen Buddhism or anything else, if people take just one piece and lift it out, it's a problem. And those are forms of life that are meant to be interlocking with complex layers. I do think, though, from my Christian point of view, at least those in our institution, we believe that the perception of wisdom, the path to wisdom Scripture provides us, is divinely inspired. So it doesn't mean there's not things for us to learn through research, lest all those millions of dollars be wasted on the global flourishing study. But I think that there are still this idea that this is an anchor point for how we approach flourishing. All right, so that's where I wanted to go. Welcome here, those of you who are joining us at Regent for the first time, and those who have been here before, welcome back. I don't think we have Q&A built in, but I'm actually done a little bit early, so what would you like to do next? Okay. All right. Back to a paradise garden. Yes. Go ahead.
Thank you for your time.
I think we have one question in the back. Sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt. Sorry. I jumped the gun.
I'm wondering how spiritual disciplines fits into your 5 or 6-part framework.
So we have a range of views on that, of course, with the different faith traditions here at Regent. My own personal belief is that's part of the process of forming the new nature, like living out the new nature. So that's how I think of it. In a Greek Orthodox sense, it fosters theosis, right? It's part of the salvation path in a Catholic tradition. All of those expressions are here at Regent's campus. So that's what I think. I'm not sure every Christian theology would think about it that way, but that these are habits. In that sense, they're virtue cultivators, right? They're habits that lead us towards the new self. And the new self is conducive to flourishing in the telos, but again, may occasionally lead us to suffer, to be true to our convictions when it's unpopular in a culture that may be hostile to our faith, or to be self-sacrificing, or something of that sort, to endure a situation where maybe a family member has a health issue that becomes a burden to help deal with, but you'd be happier maybe in one temporal sense if you fled, but staying there is what you're called to do. So those kinds of things, I think spiritual disciplines help us do better than we would do without them. So we heard from the American Bible Society that people that are Bible engaged and who have experienced trauma, help me if I get this wrong, folks, are doing better than people that haven't reported the trauma but that are not Bible engaged in their flourishing data. Okay, so I wouldn't be, that's what I mean by compensatory virtue. But it doesn't mean there's not a suffering cost there, right? I think we saw that in some of the first wave data from the global flourishing study. So Christian young people are still experiencing anxiety, but do I recall, Byron, it's about half the rate of people that are non-Christian or non-religious? So, thank you.
Any other questions before we break for lunch?
So 10 more questions will build character and virtue and delay lunch. So.
I guess we'll save that for Friday. Well, thank you again, Dr. Hathaway, for sharing your time with us this morning and your expertise.
Thanks.